The Vietnam War wasn't just a conflict fought in jungles thousands of miles away. It was a battle that really raged in American living rooms, right on the nightly news and all over college campuses. So in this explainer, we're going to unpack this whole story, the politics, the protests, and the really tough questions that honestly still echo today. This quote from Ecclesiastes, wow, it just perfectly captures the central tension of that whole era, doesn't it? It really speaks to a nation that was completely torn between its ideals of peace and the harsh, super complicated realities of war. And that right there brings us to the big question we're digging into. It's something citizens and leaders were grappling with back then, for sure, and it's a question we're all still confronting today. Let's see how the story of Vietnam can maybe shed some light on it. Okay, so how in the world did the United States get so deeply involved in a conflict halfway across the globe? Well, the main justification, the thing that started it all, really began with a single powerful idea. And that idea was called the Domino Theory. You have to remember, during the Cold War, the fear was that communism was this unstoppable, expanding force. Policymakers literally pictured country after country falling, just like a line of dominoes. You knock over the first one, and the rest are just bound to follow. Vietnam was seen as that first, absolutely critical domino in Southeast Asia. The logic, at least in their eyes, was clear. If we can just stop communism there, then we can prevent it from spreading through the whole region. This idea became the absolute bedrock of American policy. So the conflict basically pitted two major forces against each other. On one side, you had the communist North. On the other, the anti-communist South, which was being heavily backed by the United States. But, and this is a big but, it wasn't nearly that simple. Making everything way more complicated were the Viet Cong. These were communist guerrilla fighters inside South Vietnam, allied with the North. Now, for years, the American public was being told the war was going well, that we were winning, that there was light at the end of the tunnel. But then, in 1968, a single event just completely shattered that perception, and it changed everything. It was called the Tet Offensive. Right during a holiday truce, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched this massive, coordinated surprise attack all across South Vietnam. Now, militarily, it was ultimately a defeat for them. But the psychological impact, it was absolutely devastating for the U.S. war effort. So here's exactly why it was such a massive turning point. The Tet Offensive proved, without a doubt, that the enemy was organized, they were determined, and they were nowhere near collapse. For the first time, Americans were seeing the brutal reality of the fighting broadcast right into their living rooms, and a majority began to believe the war was a mistake. Public support just plummeted. And it wasn't just the enemy's strength that turned people against the war. It was also the brutal tactics being used. This included the widespread use of Agent Orange. This was a super toxic chemical designed to strip away the jungle cover, but it had these devastating long-term health consequences for absolutely everyone it touched, both soldiers and civilians alike. So, as the war kept escalating abroad, another kind of war was brewing right here, back in the United States. A cultural and political battle that really pitted generations against each other and challenged the very idea of what it meant to be an American. You can just see the deep divide right here. On one side, you had supporters arguing for stopping communism, supporting our allies, and upholding national honor. But on the other, you had protesters pointing to the total unfairness of the military draft and the shocking number of American casualties. The country was just completely torn apart. And a huge driver of those protests was the draft. This system of compulsory military service meant that young men could literally be forced to go fight and die in a war they didn't even support. To a lot of people, it felt deeply unfair, and it became this powerful symbol of an overreaching government. So, with a nation completely fractured and no clear victory anywhere in sight, the United States started looking for a way out. The end of the war would go on to reshape American foreign policy for decades to come. So how did it all wrap up? Well, President Nixon began pulling out troops through a policy he called Vietnamization, which was basically handing the fighting over to the South Vietnamese army. By 1973, all U.S. combat forces were out. But just 2 years later, South Vietnam fell to the north, and the war was finally over. At the very same time, a major political shift was happening back in Washington. As a direct response to how the war was handled, Congress passed the War Powers Act in 1973. This was a huge deal. It was a major reassertion of their authority, and it was specifically designed to stop future presidents from escalating a conflict without getting formal consent first, basically trying to make sure another Vietnam could never happen. And that brings us right back to where we started. After looking at all of this, the justifications, the incredible human cost, the division, the political fallout, the question is still there. The Vietnam War, it really offers no easy answers. All it gives us is this stark reminder of the profound, maybe impossible, challenge of discerning that time for war from the time for peace.